This is the Breaker.news podcast for the week of February 9th, 2025. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of the Breaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 382. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support the Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And on the Big Deal feature, Super Bowl 59 Sunday, the biggest day of the year for American sport, TV, and gambling. Canadian investigative reporter and academic Declan Hill is my guest. Declan Hill explains why the explosion of government-blessed betting on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border threatens the integrity of sport and the health of sports fans. Plus, hear from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. What does he promise to beef up security at Canada's unpoliced ports? This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. Super Bowl 59 between the Kansas City Chiefs and Philadelphia Eagles in New Orleans at the Superdome. Title sponsored by gambling giant Caesars. It's the biggest day of the year for American sport, TV, and gambling. Canadian investigative reporter and academic Declan Hill says the explosion of government-blessed betting on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border threatens the integrity of sport and the health of sports fans. Hill is associate professor at the University of New Haven Sports Integrity Center, host of the Crime Waves podcast, and author of 2 books on match fixing. He is my guest, joining the podcast from Lisbon, Portugal. I started by asking Declan Hill about the rush by governments to cash in on sports gambling. In Ontario, almost 3 dozen private sector websites are licensed to take bets. In British Columbia, it's still the BC Lottery Corporation government monopoly. Governments say they have high standards for integrity and safety, and they put the profits back into public service. Declan, should we have faith in what our governments are trying to sell us? That regulation of this industry, this cash cow, will do us nothing but good and will keep the bad guys sidelined and stop the bad guys?
I don't know if you can see me, Bob. I'm just laughing uproariously at the idea that we should trust government at any level, at any time, on anything. Look, first of all, sports gambling is deeply, deeply addictive. And let's start with the idea, because it's fundamentally changed. And if you're over 30 years old and you're listening to this, you know intellectually your ideas on sports gambling are old-fashioned and wrong. You, listener, thinks that you need to go to a casino, you need to go to a racetrack, or you need to go somewhere. That ain't true anymore. It's like walking around with a mobile phone is like walking around with a casino in our pocket. But what's made it even worse, what's made the change even worse, is that you've now got something called frictionless gambling, where it's built into the product by algorithms, by the same evil people that designed social media and made them so addictive, to keep pressing a button, keep pressing, getting that fugue of excitement and adrenaline. So the risk of gambling addiction is far, far higher with this new form of gambling, this frictionless gambling, which we've never seen before. 10 years ago, it simply wasn't there. To anybody under, they'll think, who is this old fogey telling me this stuff? But to begin that conversation, let's know that we're talking about a fundamentally different form of sports gambling than we've ever seen before. It is so dangerous, this new form of sports gambling. It would have been better if you were gambling with a mob. Old school mob gambling, because they couldn't addict you through your phone. You could walk away from those guys. Now, as a potential addict, you're walking around constantly with it. The other thing is, and this is generally not discussed by the government regulators who are so good across North America, is the AI systems. There are a few that are honorable exceptions, but most of them are working under the rubric of ban or bankrupt. So if Bob Mackin is a great gambler and you start breaking more than 50, really the break even for sports gambling, they're going to start cutting you down, Bob. You're going to get maybe 1,000 bets, $1,000 at first, and then you get down to 100. Listen, Bob, thanks very much, but you better take your cash somewhere else. And the only thing that you and the other lucky, fortunate sports gamblers have done is win. You bought into that commercials. You bought into the idea that you can do it. However, if you start to lose, they'll take as much of your cash as they want. They will go until you're bankrupt.
So you mentioned social media being a major problem. That has been a major vehicle for promoting sports gambling. Of course, the sports leagues love social media, but social media has also lit up throughout the NFL playoffs leading up to Super Bowl 59. Every time the Kansas City Chiefs have gotten a call favorable from referees that looks like it's in the gray area, it's lit up. There's questions about the integrity of the officials. Of course, a historic three-peat for the Chiefs in Super Bowl 59 would be a bigger storyline and probably more profitable for the NFL than a Philadelphia Eagles upset. But during Super Bowl week, NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell and Scott Green, who heads up the NFL Referees Association, they've both called those conspiracy theories.
Look, Bob, they would say something like that, wouldn't they? I mean, what else are they going to say? Even if they're true, they're still going to say that. And if they're not true, they're definitely going to say there's no problem here. Look, the dream for them is Taylor Swift walking into that Super Bowl stadium. That brings them a demographic of young women, in particular, who are generally not going to be watching the Super Bowl with any kind of enthusiasm or energy. But just a glimpse of Taylor Swift there is going to bring millions of young women watching it with great interest. I mean, that's a demographic dream. Look, I was speaking yesterday with Tim Donaghy, that's the former NBA referee that had worked with elements from the Gambino crime family to bet on NBA games while he was actually refereeing some of those games. He is a recovering gambler. Brought up that case of the Kansas City Chiefs and the suspicion going around sports media that they've been receiving favorable calls. And he and I have talked at great length. And the issue is on numerous occasions, but the issue is not whether the Kansas City Chiefs are actually receiving favorable calls, but it's just that it's enough reasonable sports fans, Bob, can look at some of those decisions, can look at some of these things and have a reasonable doubt. It's moved beyond a implausible conspiracy theory. The particular context is interesting is that his justification, his rationale, and yes, I think all our listeners should take it with a bit of a pinch of salt because he eventually ends up going to jail. But he was saying, look, the referees, we had strict injunctions by the league that there was one set of rules for the regular players and another set of rules for the Michael Jordans and the star players. And we were told people don't pay money to see Michael Jordan sit on a bench. There was influence, there was pushing to make sure that they were turning out an entertainment product as opposed to a sports product. And I think that is a really fundamental issue now and a problem now with so many people betting on sports. And then they're looking at this, quote, entertainment section of professional sports in North America. Reasonable people could now start to have that discussion, could now start to have that doubt in their minds. And that's going to be a real systematic problem for sports.
Now, in North American sport, we've seen this rise of the teams, the leagues, often selling sponsorships to the betting companies. They believe that it's going to make the spectators more engaged with the game. The revenue comes in. But how close do you think we are to a major Black Sox style scandal that breaks out that turns the sports upside down? And do you think that they have any way of escaping that? Or do you think fans sometimes just don't care? As you say, it's the entertainment product that has seemed to have come first.
They don't really care about doping. They don't really care about a lot of the soap opera stuff that, who's dating who or whatever. But this one, so I think match fixing and game rigging and underperformance are massively important to fans. What has happened with the leagues is they've started to dance with the devil. There has to be clear blue water between a bookmaking company and a sports league. And the idea that a multi-billion-dollar company like the NBA or the NFL or any of these major professional sporting leagues in North America need extra cash Guys, you're a massive multi-billion-dollar industry. Why are you just chasing that next dollar? Why can't you come up with a formula where if a league, a bookmaking operation wants to place bets on your games, okay, they got to pay you, but they got to pay you at arm's length. There was a National Football League official, senior official, Jacksonville Jaguars, who lost $22 million because he turned himself into a sports gambling addict. And I tweeted and wrote on my social media, well, geez, I really hope that he lost all that money with the official NFL bookmaker. I mean, come on. Like, how can we take this seriously? I mean, it's a walking, talking conflict of interest. So I don't have a problem with brothels. I don't have a problem with nunneries. But you shouldn't be running a brothel out of a nunnery. You've got set of agendas. And with a bookmaking company and the National Football League or these other professional sports, there should be clear blue water between those two organizations.
And you refer to the Jacksonville Jaguars financial manager, Emmett Patel. He's actually suing FanDuel, one of those major companies, because he says that they gave him too many incentives to continue gambling.
Bob, I get back to what I was saying before. What the bookmakers are now promulgating, the non-government regulated ones, unlike the BC ones, but is completely different. We've never seen this form of addiction. It's really dangerous. It's really toxic, particularly to our young men. There's an organization over in the UK that you don't want to belong to. None of our listeners want to belong to. It's called Gambling with Lives. It is a group of parents whose children have committed suicide. They're now getting 1 or 2 members a day joining their organization. That is how serious gambling addiction hits young men. And young men are the demographic that are most unlikely to talk about their mental problems or their addiction problems. And it is just going crazy with our young people. They've become addicted. And again, anyone over 30, just go hang out with young men and just keep your ears open and you'll hear them. You'll just hear these conversations of obsession on this kind of sports gambling. And they're being promulgated and they're being pushed into it because of ads, which are linking some of these Hollywood celebrities like Ben Affleck or Matt Damon, who really, I mean, a gambling addict like Ben Affleck selling gambling and betting products is outrageous. I mean, who are they going to have next? An alcoholic selling us whiskey?
We've also seen a rise in second-tier sports. We've seen a second division of soccer develop as we get a bit of a soccer pyramid here in North America. We've also seen women's sports rise. There is the WNBA, which has been around for several years. There's women's pro soccer leagues on both sides of the border. The one in Canada will be debuting this spring. And last year, of course, women's hockey, professional hockey on both sides of the border. Do you think that they're susceptible to this as well? Could the same thing happen in women's sports as well as the second tier men's sports?
Yes. In short, yes. Definitely yes. Look, I check Asian and illegal gambling websites almost on a daily basis. On the margin of most of their sites are almost every single sport that you can imagine. They'll take bets on 60,000 single sports events a day. And within those 60,000 single sports events, there'll be 20,000 particular game. Who's going to win the next set? Who's going to win the next face-off? Is the guy who's going to score the next goal going to be shooting with his left or his right hand? What are the numbers, if you add them up, of all the players on one particular team or on both teams? I mean, these are the kind of minutia bets that frictionless gambling promotes and promulgates. And they promulgate them on really obscure sports. So that's the problem, is that you can never escape them. You can never, ever escape that sports gambling market once you become addicted to the product. Live data is coming in and they're just pushing it out. Again, from the beginning of the conversation, we talked about the tip of the iceberg, athletes in Nigeria, Italy, Morocco, Spain, Greece, India, all of those people, in the last 24 hours, I've either seen or been in contact with because of this issue of underperformance in all kinds of leagues and all kinds of sports.
Now, even bigger than the Super Bowl are the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup. The Olympics are coming to Los Angeles for 2028, but even before then, coming rather quickly next year, is the FIFA World Cup 26, mostly hosted in the United States, but also co-hosted by Canada and Mexico. This is going to be the biggest single sport tournament in history. It'll last 39 days, 104 matches, 48 nations. Many of these countries will never have been to a World Cup, and some of them will be the literal minnows of world soccer. It'll be hosted in 16 cities. Vancouver and Toronto are two of those cities. How vulnerable is the FIFA World Cup to match fixing and other corruption scandals?
It's utterly vulnerable. As you know, when I was a doctoral student at the University of Oxford over in the UK, I infiltrated a gang of match fixers as they were fixing matches at the World Cup. I didn't believe it either when they first told me, and then I followed them for 9 months using hidden camera and sound recording, and I watched them do it. Each game in the World Cup on the gambling market is worth probably $1 billion. So it's very, very difficult to track the odds if there's fixing. And in some cases, you will have teams at the World Cup that don't pay their players, that rip off their players. So particularly the teams from sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, South Africa. And I'm not suggesting that the players or even those particular teams, I think there's a long tradition of corruption there because those players are so badly ripped off by their officials. And they're also pretty good teams. They're not instant pushovers. So the fixers have been playing and preying on these tournaments since at least the early 1990s when they were at the Under-17 World Cup in Melbourne. They've hit the Women's World Cup. They've hit the Olympic soccer tournament. They've hit the World Cup for men at under-20. There will be fixers at the World Cup. The problem is, at least in Canada, they legislated sports gambling in Canada, but they didn't make fixing a sports event illegal in Vancouver. And they specifically moved to Vancouver, A, because it's a beautiful city, but two, what they're doing in esports are, even if the cops were to investigate them, which most Canadian cops won't bother, because why would you investigate something that might be criminal in America, but it ain't criminal in Canada?
Well, that leads me to the final question. What can be done?
Look, there's three really obviously simple things. And once I outline it to your listeners, they'll be scratching their head going, come on, that's so basic. Why not? One, we need to make match fixing illegal in Canada. And you can do that in an afternoon in the federal parliament in Ottawa. You change a few words in the criminal code and bingo, it's done. Two, we need to put a 0.25% integrity tax on all legal gambling in Canada. That is 25 cents out of $100. And that instantly goes to a new sports integrity agency, as they have in Australia, that can deal with this issue seriously, properly, and 24/7. Won't cost very, very much money on the gambling markets, is nothing, but it can have the power. It can start getting this question well-resourced in an independent agency. And finally, we need what the Australians have, which is a small independent agency of police officers who've been well-trained. I mean, it's embarrassing for me as a Canadian. I'm literally flown to the Australian cops to train these guys so that they can protect the Australian Open. They can protect all these amazing sports. They can continue to be a sporting giant. But in my own country, Bob, we're not even, the federal politicians aren't even beginning to have that kind of conversation. So those are three very simple things that you can do. Make it illegal, put a very, very small tax on every single legal sports gambling in Canada to go forward towards integrity, and have a dedicated police unit. Doesn't have to be a huge one. We've got lots of problems, lots of different criminal problems in Canada, fentanyl, whatever, but just dedicate a little bit towards protecting our sports. And frankly, Canadians of all age are going to thank people for doing that, for protecting sports.
Thanks again for joining me on the podcast. My guest, Declan Hill, the Associate Professor at the University of New Haven Sports Integrity Center, author of The Fix, Soccer and Organized Crime, and The Insider's Guide to Match Fixing in Football. And he's also the host of the Crime Waves podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Joining me from Portugal.
I read all your stuff. I'm subscribed, so I'm really honored to be included in this. Thanks so much, Bob.
This interview was edited for brevity and to mitigate for data transmission issues. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre vowed February 5th in Vancouver to beef up security at Canadian ports to stop shipments of fentanyl and precursor chemicals. But he was non-committal when I asked him if that would also include restoring the Ports Canada Police or installing RCMP detachments on the docks. Despite national security warnings, Jean Chrétien's Liberal government defunded the Ports Police in 1997. Poilievre came to the Timac launch service with DP World's Centerm in the background on one of Vancouver's coldest mornings of the year. He proposes life jail sentences for fentanyl kingpins as part of his reaction to Donald Trump's tariff threats. I also asked him about the war of words in the Conservative nomination contest for Richmond East Steveston. As I reported in theBreaker.news in the wake of the Hogue Commission's final report, challenger Y. Young, an ex-Vancouver South MP, is peddling disinformation against her rival, the riding's 2019 to 2021 MP, Kenny Chiu. The Foreign Interference Inquiry's report did confirm that China worked to unseat Chiu and other Conservatives in 2021.
We'll now take questions from the floor, starting with The Breaker.
Hi, Bob Mackin with theBreaker.news. Good morning. You're here at the port, and you referenced 99% of containers do not get checked. And you've got your candidate here who is a police officer himself. There have been reports recently, one by Peter German, former head of the RCMP for Western Canada, who recommends restoring ports police to ports here on the West Coast and also East Coast. And the ports police used to have headquarters very close to here. The Chrétien Liberals shut it down. Will you bring back the Ports Police as the Canada Ports Police, or will you open up RCP detachments at ports? And also wanted to get your comment on what's going on with your nomination race in Steveston Richmond East, where Y. Young issued a statement last week downplaying the Hogue Commission report and blaming Kenny Chiu, the former MP there, who's also seeking the nomination, blaming him for causing rift in the community. He's fired back and says that she's lying about the contents of the Hogue Commission report, which actually did find that Chinese government actors did target the Conservatives in 2021.
So first of all, obviously Conservatives have been victims of foreign interference. It's clear that Beijing wanted to keep Justin Trudeau in power. I've no doubt that they'll want Mark Carney to stay in power. Mark Carney has a background of shipping investment to China and favoring foreign economies over the Canadian economy. We need a prime minister who will put Canada first. On the question of ports, you're quite right. Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney and the Liberals have destroyed our border security and our ports. After 9 years of the Carney-Trudeau Liberals, our ports are allowing 99% of shipping containers to enter our country with no inspection. And that's where the drug ingredients, the guns, the stolen cars come into our country or leave to support massive crime networks. I announced that I will eliminate 2,000 bureaucrats and replace them with 2,000 extra CBSA agents who will have the power to surveil our entire border. They will also have the ability to use new high-tech scanners that can peer right through the metal walls of shipping containers to spot drugs, guns, and stolen cars. We will also expand our border security across the entire border with surveillance towers, drones, helicopters. I've said the military should immediately go to the borders to block fentanyl traffickers and other lawbreakers. The radical Trudeau-Carney experiment with open borders and post-national globalism has not only divided and weakened our country's sense of identity, it has endangered our people. When I'm Prime Minister, that radical, borderless, globalist ideology pushed by the Trudeau-Carney Liberals will end, and we will have a Prime Minister that seals the border, protects our people, and puts Canada first.
Now it's time on the theBreaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In Focus Taiwan.tw, opposition lawmaker calls for government clarification on DeepSeek ban. Kuomintang's Li Yanshu criticized the Ministry of Digital Affairs for failing to provide sufficient explanation when it announced the ban on January 31st, citing concerns over potential data leaks. The government warned DeepSeek could pose a national cybersecurity risk. In ABC News Australia, AI is growing exponentially, so too are its demands on energy. As much as 327 gigawatts of energy capacity, 5 times the size of Australia's national energy market, could be needed globally by 2030 to power AI. It takes a lot of energy and water to develop the massive artificial intelligence models taking over the globe, so much so that technology giants like Microsoft plan to restart nuclear plants to handle rising electricity costs. In Anchorage Daily News, Iditarod says it plans to maintain southern route for 2025 race. Low snowpack throughout much of Alaska had put the southern route, traditionally raced in odd-numbered years, in jeopardy. The ceremonial start is still scheduled for downtown Anchorage on March 1st. The race ends in Nome on the Norton Sound coast. 34 mushers have signed up, including 2023 champion Ryan Reddington. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In Willamette Week, Pacific Corp was grossly negligent in Oregon's 2020 wildfires. Now it's asking lawmakers for protection. Electric utility Pacific Corp has waged a campaign in the courts and now in the halls of the state capitol to reduce its financial obligation. A jury found Pacific Corp negligent for the 2020 Labor Day fires in Oregon. The Santiam fire burned 400,000 acres, half the size of Rhode Island. 5 people died. Meanwhile, also in Willamette Week, the owners of the Portland Pickles minor league baseball team are launching a soccer team in USL League 2 this summer. They're calling it the Portland Bangers. In Crosscut, Washington lawmakers weigh new artificial intelligence regulations. From forged digital likenesses to mandating AI detection software, officials in Olympia are considering 4 bills on the fast-growing technology. In 2024, the legislature created a task force to recommend how the legislature and state government should address AI issues. Its members include legislators, state officials, business interests, tribes, advocacy organizations geared toward discrimination issues, consumer and civil liberties interests, law enforcement, and universities. And check out theBreaker.news and bobmackin.substack.com for the stories behind these headlines. Kenny Chu responds to Wai Young's reckless, dishonest statement, and Trump-Trudeau trade war front and center on U.S. TV. Read the stories behind the headlines. Go to theBreaker.news or bobmackin.substack.com. That's Cascadia calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to the athletes competing in Prince Harry's Invictus Games in Vancouver and Whistler until February 16th. Best of luck to the more than 500 veterans and active military personnel with disabilities from more than 20 nations. And you can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of February 9th, 2025. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 9th of February in 1964, music and TV history, the Beatles made their first Ed Sullivan Show TV appearance? And on the 9th of February in 1991, Lithuania voted to leave the Soviet Union. Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. and introducing bobmackin.substack.com. Visit me there too. Sign up for the free email newsletter and get updates to your inbox, or follow The Breaker News as news happens on X, formerly Twitter. And you can support The Breaker for as little as $7 a month. For more information, go to bobmackin.substack.com. Until next week.